In the glittering world of European royalty, where every smile is scrutinized and every absence noticed, Queen Camilla of Valdoria vanished without a trace, just hours before the most important ceremony of the decade. What started as a missing person case would uncover secrets that threatened to topple a 1,000-year-old monarchy and reveal the true price of wearing a crown. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as Lady Margaret rushed through the ornate corridors, her heels clicking against the cold stone. Something was terribly wrong. Queen Camilla's private chambers stood empty, her bed unslept in, and the elaborate gown intended for today's royal heritage ceremony hung abandoned on its ornate stand. King Charles of Valdoria stood at his office window, watching the early morning preparations in the palace courtyard below. Workers hung banners and arranged seating for what would be the largest royal gathering in 50 years. Representatives from 12 European kingdoms were arriving throughout the day, and by evening, the eyes of the world would be upon Valdoria. The ceremony would officially recognize Prince William as heir apparent, a tradition that had continued unbroken for centuries. "Your Majesty," Lady Margaret's voice trembled as she entered without her usual composed demeanor. "We have a situation." Charles turned, immediately recognizing the gravity in his longtime aide's expression. Lady Margaret had served the royal family for 30 years, had weathered political scandals, economic crises, and family tragedies with unwavering composure. Nothing rattled her. "What is it, Margaret?" "The Queen, sir. She's not in her chambers. Her security detail hasn't seen her since yesterday evening, and—" Margaret hesitated, then continued. "Her personal phone and jewelry are still in her room, but her passport is missing." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. Camilla never went anywhere without her wedding ring, a family heirloom that had belonged to his grandmother. For it to remain behind while she disappeared suggested either foul play or a deliberate decision to abandon her royal identity entirely. Charles moved to his desk, his mind racing through possibilities. "Have you checked the private gardens? The library?" "Perhaps she couldn't sleep and went for a walk." "We've searched everywhere, sir. The security footage from the main gates shows no unusual activity." But Margaret paused again, clearly uncomfortable with what she had to reveal next. "But what?" "The footage from the East Wing, near the Queen's private entrance, has been mysteriously corrupted. The cameras show nothing but static from 11 p.m. last night until 6 a.m. this morning." Charles felt his stomach drop. The East Wing entrance was known only to family members and the most trusted staff. It was the route Camilla used when she wanted to move through the palace undetected, particularly during her frequent visits to the children's hospital in the city. For that specific camera system to malfunction at precisely the time of her disappearance was too convenient to be coincidental. "Who else knows about this?" Charles asked, already dreading the answer. "Only myself, Chief of Security Harrison, and Detective Inspector Sarah Wells, who Harrison called in from the capital. I've instructed them to maintain absolute discretion until we understand what we're dealing with." Charles nodded, grateful for Margaret's foresight. If word leaked that the Queen had disappeared just hours before the most significant royal ceremony in decades, it would create a scandal that could destabilize not just Valdoria's monarchy, but potentially affect the delicate political relationships with their neighboring kingdoms. "I need to speak with Detective Wells immediately," Charles said, straightening his shoulders, "and cancel my morning appointments. Tell them I'm reviewing ceremony details." As Margaret left to arrange the meeting, Charles walked to his private safe and retrieved a small leather journal he'd hoped never to need. Inside were details about threats against the royal family, information too sensitive for official security files. As he flipped through the pages, one entry made his blood run cold. 3 months ago, Camilla had received an anonymous letter. Unlike the usual harmless correspondence from citizens, this one contained specific details about her daily routines, places she visited privately, even the names of children at the hospital she regularly read to. The letter had ended with a chilling message: "Queens who forget their place can easily be reminded of their mortality." The letter had been filed away, dismissed as the work of a disturbed individual with no real means to carry out threats. But now, with Camilla missing, and the ceremony just hours away, Charles realized they might have underestimated the danger. Detective Inspector Sarah Wells arrived within the hour, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s whose reputation for solving high-profile cases had earned her the trust of government officials throughout Europe. She listened intently as Charles explained the situation, taking careful notes and asking pointed questions about Camilla's recent behavior, her relationships, and any possible reasons she might have for disappearing voluntarily. "Your Majesty," Detective Wells said after reviewing the initial findings, "I need to ask some difficult questions. Had you and the Queen been experiencing any personal difficulties? Any disagreements about today's ceremony or Prince William's recognition as heir?" Charles considered the question carefully. His relationship with Camilla had been strong, built on mutual respect and shared dedication to their royal duties. But recently she had seemed distant, troubled by something she wouldn't discuss. When he'd asked about it, she'd simply said she was tired from the ceremony preparations. "There was nothing specific," Charles replied. "Though she had been quieter lately, more thoughtful. I assumed it was stress from today's events. What about external pressures? Political opposition to the monarchy? Business interests that might benefit from royal instability?" Charles's mind immediately went to the ongoing debate in Parliament about the monarchy's role in modern Valdoria. A vocal minority had been pushing for constitutional changes that would significantly reduce royal powers, and some had suggested that the heritage ceremony was an outdated tradition that should be abandoned. But these were political disagreements, not the kind of threats that would lead to kidnapping. "There's been political opposition," Charles admitted, "but nothing that seemed dangerous. Most of our critics prefer parliamentary debate to direct action." Detective Wells made another note, then looked up with the expression that suggested she'd seen this pattern before. "In my experience, when someone with Queen Camilla's profile disappears just before a major public event, we're usually dealing with one of three scenarios: kidnapping for ransom or political leverage, voluntary disappearance due to overwhelming pressure, or—" She paused, and Charles prompted her. "Or what? Someone who knew her routines, had access to palace security systems, and understood exactly when to act for maximum impact." The suggestion that Camilla's disappearance might be an inside job sent a chill through Charles. The royal household employed over 300 people, from senior advisors to kitchen staff. Each had been thoroughly vetted, but Detective Wells was right that the specifics of the disappearance suggested intimate knowledge of palace operations. As they spoke, Lady Margaret returned with an update that complicated the situation further. "Sir, I've been reviewing the Queen's appointments from yesterday. She had a private meeting scheduled for 8 p.m. with someone listed only as C. Morrison. None of her usual staff arranged this meeting, and there's no record of this person in our visitor logs." Detective Wells immediately focused on this information. "Was this meeting in her official calendar?" "No," Margaret replied. "I found it written in her personal diary, in her own handwriting. Just the time and initials." Charles felt a new wave of concern. Camilla was meticulous about her official schedule, but she also valued her privacy. It wasn't unusual for her to have personal meetings that weren't recorded in official palace records, particularly when they involved her charitable work or personal friends. But the timing of this mystery meeting, just hours before her disappearance, was troubling. "We need to find out who C. Morrison is," Detective Wells said. "And we need to do it quickly. Every hour that passes makes it less likely we'll find the Queen unharmed." As the morning progressed and preparation for the ceremony continued around them, Charles found himself caught between his duty as a king and his fear as a husband. The heritage ceremony couldn't be postponed without creating an international incident. But how could he stand before the assembled nobility and proclaim his son heir to the throne while his wife remained missing? By noon, with still no word from or about Camilla, Charles made a decision that would change everything. He would proceed with the ceremony as planned, but he would also authorize Detective Wells to take whatever measures necessary to find his wife, regardless of the potential embarrassment to the crown. What none of them knew was that Camilla was closer than they imagined, and that her disappearance was only the beginning of a chain of events that would expose secrets hidden within the palace walls for decades. The mysterious C. Morrison was indeed real, and their meeting the previous evening had revealed information that threatened not just Camilla's life, but the very foundation of the Valdorian monarchy itself. Detective Inspector Sarah Wells established her command center in a small conference room adjacent to the palace's security office. The room quickly filled with photographs, timeline charts, and evidence bags as her team worked methodically through every detail of Queen Camilla's last known movements. The pressure was immense. With each passing hour, the likelihood of finding the Queen alive diminished, and the evening ceremony loomed like a deadline they couldn't avoid. "We've identified C. Morrison," announced Detective Constable James Park, Wells's most trusted investigator. Christina Morrison, age 52, former palace employee who worked in the household accounting department until she was dismissed 18 months ago. Wells looked up from the security footage she'd been reviewing. Dismissed for what reason? "That's where it gets interesting," Park continued, consulting his notes. Officially, it was listed as restructuring due to budget constraints. But I spoke with 2 former colleagues who said Morrison had been asking questions about historical palace expenditures, particularly regarding restoration projects from the 90s. The pieces of a puzzle Wells hadn't known existed began forming in her mind. What kind of questions? Apparently, Morrison discovered discrepancies in the records, large sums allocated for restoration work that seemed to disappear without corresponding improvements to the palace. When she tried to investigate further, she was suddenly let go. King Charles, who had been listening quietly from the corner of the room, stepped forward. The 90s restoration project was overseen by Lord Edmund Hartwell, my late father's closest advisor. Edmund died 5 years ago, and his records were sealed as confidential royal documents. In her experience, financial irregularities often provided motives for blackmail, kidnapping, or worse. If Christina Morrison had uncovered evidence of corruption involving palace funds, and if Queen Camilla had agreed to meet with her about it, they might be dealing with a situation far more complex than a simple disappearance. "We need to find Morrison immediately," Wells instructed her team, "and I want those restoration records unsealed. Your Majesty, I'll need your authorization to access confidential royal documents." Opening sealed royal records would set a precedent that could expose the monarchy to future scrutiny of its financial dealings. But with Camilla missing and time running out, protecting institutional privacy seemed less important than protecting his wife. "You have my authorization," he said quietly. While her team worked to locate Christina Morrison, Wells decided to examine Queen Camilla's private chambers more thoroughly. She'd learned that important clues were often found in the details others overlooked, and the royal quarters might contain evidence that the initial search had missed. Lady Margaret led her through the Queen's private suite, an elegant collection of rooms that reflected Camilla's personal taste rather than ceremonial requirements. Wells noted the books on the bedside table, the photographs on the desk, the clothes in the wardrobe. Everything suggested a woman who had planned to return. Personal items were arranged as if she expected to use them again soon. "Tell me about the Queen's mood in recent weeks," Wells asked as they examined the sitting room. Was she worried about anything specific? Lady Margaret considered the question carefully. She'd been receiving more mail than usual. Personal letters, not official correspondence. She always read them privately and never discussed their contents. But I noticed she seemed troubled after reading several of them. Where would these letters be kept? The Queen maintained a private correspondence file in her desk. She was very particular about handling her personal mail herself. They found the file in the bottom drawer of an antique writing desk. Most of the letters were routine correspondence from friends and relatives. But 5 letters stood out. They were typed rather than handwritten, formal in tone, and all bore the same return address, a post office box in the capital city. Wells read the most recent letter, dated just 1 week ago. "Your Majesty, I hope this finds you well. Our previous correspondence has established my credibility regarding the palace restoration matter. The evidence I've gathered will be of great interest to you, as it directly concerns your family's honor. I believe it's time we met to discuss how this situation can be resolved to everyone's benefit. I will contact you soon to arrange a private meeting. Respectfully, Christina Morrison." The letter's tone was polite, but contained an unmistakable undercurrent of threat. Wells realized they were dealing with sophisticated blackmail rather than a random kidnapping. Morrison had been building up to this meeting for months, gradually revealing enough information to convince Camilla that she needed to respond personally. Has the Queen seemed concerned about the family's reputation lately? Wells asked Lady Margaret. Any mention of historical issues or past scandals? Nothing specific, Margaret replied. But she did ask me several weeks ago about the process for accessing old palace records. She said she was researching the history of royal charitable donations for a speech she was writing. Wells suspected that Camilla's research had been prompted by Morrison's earlier letters. The Queen had likely been trying to verify whatever claims Morrison was making about the restoration project. This explained her recent distant behavior. She'd been dealing with a potential scandal while trying to protect her family and the monarchy's reputation. A knock at the door interrupted their investigation. Detective Constable Park entered with an expression that suggested both progress and problems. "We've located Christina Morrison's current address," he reported, "but there's a complication. The building manager says she moved out 3 days ago, paid her lease in full, and left no forwarding address. However, neighbors report seeing her loading boxes into a van with the help of 2 men. Wells felt her concern deepening. If Morrison had planned her disappearance from her residence in advance, it suggested this was a carefully orchestrated operation rather than an opportunistic crime. The involvement of accomplices also meant that finding Queen Camilla would be significantly more challenging. What about the van? Any description of the men helping her? The neighbor who saw them said they looked professional, possibly private security or moving company employees. The van was white, commercial style, but she didn't notice any company markings or license plates. As Wells processed this information, another piece of the puzzle emerged. Chief of Security Harrison arrived with news that the corrupted security footage from the East Wing had been partially recovered by the palace's IT department. "We can't see clear images," Harrison explained, "but we can make out shadows and movement patterns. Someone definitely used the east entrance around midnight, and based on the timing and movement, it appears they were helping someone leave rather than forcing them out." This revelation changed everything. If Camilla had left voluntarily with someone she trusted enough to meet privately, they weren't dealing with a traditional kidnapping. But voluntary departure just before the most important royal ceremony in decades suggested either extreme duress or information so damaging that the Queen felt she had no choice but to disappear. Wells decided it was time to be completely honest with King Charles about what they were facing. She found him in his office staring out the window at the ceremony preparations that continued despite the crisis unfolding around them. "Your Majesty," she began carefully, "I believe Queen Camilla left the palace voluntarily last night, most likely with Christina Morrison and at least one accomplice. Based on the evidence, this appears to be related to information Morrison discovered about palace financial irregularities in the 1990s. Charles turned from the window, his face reflecting the weight of the situation. "Are you saying my wife has been kidnapped because of something that happened 30 years ago? I'm saying she may have felt that meeting with Morrison privately was the only way to protect the monarchy from a scandal. What I need to know is whether there's anything about the restoration project that could be used to damage the royal family's reputation." Charles was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with information he'd hoped never to reveal. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Lord Edmund Hartwell was like a father to me after my parents died. He managed the palace restoration project with complete authority, and I never questioned his decisions. But after his death, when we were organizing his personal effects, we found—" Charles paused, struggling with the words. "What did you find, Your Majesty?" "Evidence that he had been diverting restoration funds to offshore accounts, not for personal gain, but to secretly fund humanitarian operations in war zones where the royal family couldn't be seen providing direct aid. At the time, official neutrality prevented us from helping civilians in certain conflicts, so Edmund created an unofficial channel for assistance." Wells understood immediately why this information would be devastating if made public. While the motivation might have been humanitarian, the diversion of funds without proper authorization would be seen as corruption. Even worse, secret funding of operations in conflict zones could be interpreted as covert political interference, potentially damaging Valdoria's relationships with multiple nations. How much money was involved? Over 10 million euros, spread across several years. All of it was eventually used for humanitarian purposes, but the lack of official documentation and oversight would make it appear criminal to outside observers. As if summoned by the weight of their conversation, Lady Margaret appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Your Majesty," she said urgently, "we've received a phone call. Someone claiming to represent Queen Camilla says she's safe but can't return to the palace until after the ceremony. They want to arrange a private meeting with you tomorrow morning." Wells immediately took charge. Did they provide any proof that they actually have the Queen? Any way to verify she's unharmed? They said to tell His Majesty that the roses in the East Garden need pruning before the frost arrives. Apparently, this is something only the Queen would know to say. Charles nodded grimly. It was indeed a private reference that only Camilla would know, related to a conversation they'd had just last week about their personal garden maintenance. "What else did they say?" Wells asked. "That Queen Camilla is cooperating with their investigation into historical palace finances, and that she'll be returned safely once they've reached a mutual understanding about how certain information should be handled." Wells realized they were now dealing with sophisticated blackmailers who were using Queen Camilla's own sense of duty and protective instincts against her. They'd convinced her that cooperating with them was the best way to protect the monarchy, effectively making her a willing participant in her own kidnapping. But as the afternoon wore on and the ceremony drew closer, Wells discovered that Christina Morrison and her accomplices had made one crucial mistake. In their careful planning, they'd overlooked a security feature that would ultimately lead to their downfall. Every vehicle entering or leaving the palace grounds in the past week had been automatically photographed by hidden traffic cameras, and one of those photographs was about to break the case wide open. The hidden traffic cameras had captured what human observers missed: a white commercial van that had made 3 trips to the palace grounds over the past week, always during shift changes when security attention was divided. Detective Inspector Wells studied the photographs with growing excitement, finally seeing the pattern that would lead them to Queen Camilla. "The van belongs to Heritage Document Services," reported Detective Constable Park, consulting the registration database. "They specialize in archival work for historical institutions. According to their website, they help organizations digitize and organize old records." Wells felt the pieces clicking into place. Christina Morrison didn't just stumble onto information about the palace restoration funds. She's been systematically accessing palace archives under the cover of a legitimate document preservation service. King Charles leaned forward from his position at the conference table. The ceremony was set to begin in 4 hours, and guests from across Europe were already arriving at the palace. The pressure to resolve the situation was becoming unbearable. "Are you saying this entire operation has been months in the planning?" he asked. "I'm saying Morrison has been gathering evidence systematically," Wells replied. "She was fired from the palace accounting department 18 months ago, but she's maintained access to historical records through this document service. She's had time to build a comprehensive case about the restoration fund irregularities." The revelation that Morrison had continued accessing palace documents after her dismissal was disturbing enough, but Wells was beginning to suspect something even more troubling. The sophistication of the operation, the careful timing, the inside knowledge of palace security systems all suggested that Morrison wasn't working alone or for simple financial gain. "Constable Park, I need you to research Heritage Document Services thoroughly. Who owns it, when it was established, what other institutions they've worked with. And I want to know every employee who's had access to palace documents in the past year." As Park left to conduct his research, Wells turned her attention to the immediate problem of locating Queen Camilla. The phone call had confirmed she was alive but provided no clues about her location. However, the van's registration information gave them their first concrete lead. "The van is registered to an address in the industrial district," reported Chief of Security Harrison. "It's listed as the headquarters for Heritage Document Services, but according to the City Planning Office, that building has been vacant for 6 months. Wells recognized the pattern of a shell company designed to provide legitimacy while hiding the real operation. They're using false business credentials to gain access to sensitive locations. This isn't amateur blackmail. This is professional intelligence gathering. The implications were staggering. If Morrison was working for foreign interests seeking to destabilize the Valdorian monarchy, Queen Camilla's disappearance could be just the beginning of a larger operation. Wells immediately contacted her superiors in the capital, requesting background checks on everyone connected to Heritage Document Services. While waiting for the intelligence reports, Wells decided to examine the timeline more carefully. Morrison had been dismissed from the palace 18 months ago, but Heritage Document Services had begun working with the palace archives only 6 months ago. The gap suggested a period of planning and preparation that indicated significant resources and expertise. Lady Margaret. Wells called to the senior aide, "I need you to think carefully about the Queen's behavior over the past 6 months. Any changes in her routine, new interests in palace history, meetings with people involved in archival work?" Margaret consulted her detailed notes, a habit that Wells was learning to appreciate. Actually, yes. Beginning about 4 months ago, the Queen became very interested in the history of royal charitable giving. She spent several afternoons in the palace archives, reading through old financial records and correspondence. Was she working with anyone from Heritage Document Services during these visits? Yes, there was a young man named David Chen who helped her locate specific documents. He was very knowledgeable about the filing systems and seemed familiar with royal protocols. Wells felt a chill of recognition. In her experience, intelligence operations often involved placing attractive, knowledgeable operatives in positions where they could build trust with their targets. If David Chen had been cultivating a relationship with Queen Camilla for months, he would have been perfectly positioned to convince her to meet with Morrison privately. "I need a complete background check on David Chen immediately," Wells instructed Harrison. "And I want to know if he's actually an employee of Heritage Document Services, or if he was placed there specifically to access the palace." As the investigation intensified, the ceremonial preparations continued around them. Wells could see the stress on King Charles's face as he balanced his duties as a monarch with his fears as a husband. The heritage ceremony couldn't be postponed without creating an international incident, but proceeding without Queen Camilla would generate speculation that could damage the monarchy, regardless of how the situation was resolved. Detective Constable Park returned with information that confirmed Wells's worst suspicions about the scope of the operation they were facing. Heritage Document Services was established 8 months ago by a shell company registered in Switzerland, he reported. The funding traces back through several offshore accounts, but our financial crimes unit believes the ultimate source may be a foreign government seeking to destabilize European monarchies. If Queen Camilla had been targeted by a foreign intelligence operation, her safety became a matter of national security rather than personal protection. The carefully planned approach, the months of preparation, the sophisticated blackmail strategy, all pointed to resources and expertise beyond what civilian criminals could manage. "What about David Chen?" she asked. "No record of anyone by that name working for Heritage Document Services. In fact, the company appears to have only 3 employees, all of them aliases. We're dealing with a completely fabricated organization." King Charles stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking under the pressure. "Are you telling me that my wife has been kidnapped by foreign spies? That this entire situation is an attack on Valdoria's sovereignty? I'm telling you that we're dealing with a professional operation designed to compromise the royal family through blackmail and coercion," Wells replied. "Queen Camilla may believe she's protecting the monarchy by cooperating, but she's actually been manipulated into participating in what amounts to an intelligence operation against her own country. The revelation transformed the situation from a missing person case into a matter of national security." Wells immediately contacted the intelligence services, requesting immediate support for what was now classified as a counter-espionage operation. But even as additional resources were mobilized, time was running out. The ceremony would begin in less than 3 hours, and every minute that passed gave the perpetrators more leverage over the royal family. As if responding to the increased urgency, Lady Margaret received another phone call, this time with specific demands that revealed the true scope of what they were facing. "They want His Majesty to publicly acknowledge irregularities in the palace's historical financial management," Margaret reported after ending the call. "They're demanding that he announce during tonight's ceremony that the royal family is commissioning an independent audit of all palace expenditures from the past 30 years. Wells realized that the perpetrators had been planning not just to kidnap Queen Camilla, but to use the heritage ceremony itself as a platform for humiliating the monarchy. Forcing King Charles to admit to financial irregularities in front of assembled European nobility would damage Valdoria's reputation and potentially destabilize political relationships throughout the region. What happens if His Majesty refuses? Wells asked. Margaret's expression was grim. They say they'll release detailed financial documents to international media outlets immediately after the ceremony concludes. Documents that will make it appear the royal family has been systematically embezzling restoration funds for decades. Charles sank into his chair, the weight of impossible choices evident in his posture. Comply with the demands, and he would damage the monarchy's reputation while setting a precedent for future blackmail. Refuse, and the manufactured scandal would be even worse, potentially destroying the institution he'd devoted his life to protecting. But Wells had been thinking about the perpetrators' timeline and demands, and she'd noticed a critical weakness in their plan. They needed King Charles to make his announcement during the ceremony, which meant they had to keep Queen Camilla alive and unharmed at least until tonight. This gave Wells a narrow window of opportunity to locate and rescue her before the demands had to be met. Your Majesty, Wells said with growing confidence, I believe I know where they're holding Queen Camilla, and I think we can get her back before you have to make any public statements. The breakthrough had come from studying the perpetrators' behavior patterns rather than their stated demands. Wells had realized that everything about the operation pointed to people who understood royal protocol and palace operations intimately. They weren't foreign spies working from intelligence reports. They were individuals with direct experience of how the royal household functioned. David Chen might be an alias, but I believe he's actually someone who worked closely with the palace archives in the past, Wells explained. Someone familiar enough with royal procedures to move freely through the palace and knowledgeable enough about the restoration project to understand its vulnerabilities. Her theory was about to be proven correct, and the revelation of David Chen's true identity would expose not just a sophisticated blackmail operation, but a personal betrayal that cut to the heart of the royal family's trust in those closest to them. Detective Inspector Wells's breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the palace's employee identification database. While reviewing archive access logs from the past year, she discovered that David Chen had been using security credentials that belonged to Thomas Whitmore, a former palace historian who had died in a car accident 9 months earlier. Someone had been using a dead man's identity to access the most sensitive areas of the palace archives. Thomas Whitmore, Lady Margaret said when shown the photograph from the personnel file. Of course, he worked closely with Lord Edmund Hartwell on the restoration project documentation in the 1990s. He would have known exactly where to find evidence of the financial irregularities. Wells felt the satisfaction of puzzle pieces falling into place. But Thomas Whitmore is dead. So who has been using his credentials? The answer came from Chief of Security Harrison, who had been cross-referencing the archive access logs with security camera footage from the past 6 months. The man who's been calling himself David Chen is actually Michael Whitmore, Thomas's younger brother. He was employed as a palace maintenance supervisor until he was dismissed for unauthorized access to restricted areas. When was he dismissed? Wells asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. 18 months ago, the same week as Christina Morrison. Wells realized they'd been looking at this case backwards. Morrison and Michael Whitmore hadn't been dismissed for unrelated reasons. They'd been caught working together to access sensitive palace information. Their current operation wasn't opportunistic blackmail, but the continuation of an investigation they'd begun while still employed at the palace. They've been planning this for over a year, Wells told King Charles. Morrison provided the accounting expertise to identify financial irregularities, while Michael Whitmore used his brother's credentials to access historical documents that could prove their case. They weren't dismissed for budget reasons. They were fired because someone suspected what they were doing. Charles looked puzzled. But who would have suspected them? And why wasn't I told about security concerns regarding palace employees? Lady Margaret answered reluctantly. Lord Edmund's personal secretary, Victoria Hayes, reported suspicious behavior from both Morrison and Whitmore shortly before their dismissals. She said they were asking too many questions about restoration project documentation and spending time in archive areas outside their normal duties. Victoria Hayes. Charles repeated the name with recognition. She managed Edmund's correspondence and files right up until his death. If anyone would know about irregularities in the restoration project, it would be her. Wells felt another piece of the puzzle click into place.
"Where is Victoria Hayes now?" "She retired after Lord Edmund's death," Margaret replied.
She said the work became too emotionally difficult after losing him. She moved to a cottage in the countryside, about an hour from the palace. Wells's instincts told her that Victoria Hayes was more important to this case than anyone had realized. If Morrison and Whitmore had been dismissed based on her suspicions, and if she had access to Lord Edmund's private files about the restoration project, she might be either a crucial witness or another potential target.
"I need to speak with Victoria Hayes immediately," Wells declared. "If she knows details about the restoration project that haven't been documented elsewhere, she might be able to help us understand exactly what Morrison and Whitmore discovered." While Detective Constable Park located Victoria Hayes's current address, Wells reviewed the timeline once more. The heritage ceremony was set to begin in 2 hours, but she was beginning to suspect that Morrison's demands about the public announcement were a diversion from their real objective. The sophistication of their operation suggested goals beyond simple blackmail or embarrassment. "Your Majesty," Wells said carefully, "I need to ask you about Lord Edmund's death. Was there anything unusual about the car accident?" Charles looked surprised by the question. It was investigated thoroughly. The roads were icy, visibility was poor, and Edmund was driving alone late at night. The investigators concluded it was a tragic accident, but the timing was convenient for anyone who wanted his secrets to remain buried, Wells observed. If Edmund had lived, he might have been able to explain the Restoration Fund irregularities in a way that protected the monarchy's reputation. The implication was disturbing but couldn't be ignored. If Morrison and Whitmore had been investigating Lord Edmund's financial management for months before his death, they might have confronted him with evidence of irregularities. His subsequent death, whether accidental or otherwise, had left them with damaging information, but no way to verify his explanations or motivations. Wells's phone rang with an update from Detective Constable Park that changed everything. "Inspector, Victoria Hayes isn't at her cottage. According to the neighbors, she left yesterday morning with 2 people in a white van. They haven't seen her since." The revelation hit Wells like a physical blow. Victoria Hayes hadn't been a witness. She'd been another target. Morrison and Whitmore weren't just blackmailing the royal family. They were systematically gathering everyone who had knowledge of Lord Edmund's restoration project activities. "They have Victoria Hayes, too," Wells announced to the room. "This isn't about blackmail anymore. They're collecting all the witnesses to what happened 30 years ago." King Charles stood slowly, his face pale with the growing realization of what they were confronting. "Are you saying they plan to expose the entire restoration project scandal at once, during the ceremony?" "I'm saying they plan to present a comprehensive case that will make it impossible for the royal family to deny or explain away the financial irregularities. Queen Camilla, Victoria Hayes, and potentially others are being held as witnesses to testify to whatever story Morrison and Whitmore want to tell." As if summoned by the urgency of their discussion, Chief of Security Harrison burst into the room with news that confirmed Wells's worst fears. "Inspector, we've intercepted communications indicating that Morrison's group has contacted multiple international media outlets," Harrison reported breathlessly. "They've scheduled simultaneous press releases for immediately after the heritage ceremony concludes. Whatever they're planning, it's designed for maximum international exposure." Wells realized that time had run out for a careful investigation. Morrison and Whitmore had orchestrated their operation to culminate during the ceremony itself, when the world's attention would be focused on the Valdorian royal family. Any scandal revealed at that moment would have devastating international impact. "We need to find them now," Wells declared, "before the ceremony begins." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the palace's own historical records. While reviewing Lord Edmund's archived correspondence, Lady Margaret discovered references to a private storage facility where sensitive documents had been kept during the restoration project. The facility had been purchased by the royal estate, but had never been officially documented in palace records. "Edmund bought it through a private company to maintain secrecy," Margaret explained. "If Morrison and Whitmore have been investigating his activities, they would have discovered this location. It's the perfect place to hold people while they sort through decades of confidential documents."
Wells felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a case breaking open. Where is this facility? About 20 minutes from the palace, in an industrial area near the old textile district. According to Edmund's notes, it's designed to look like an abandoned warehouse from the outside. As Wells organized a rescue operation with available security personnel, she realized that Morrison and Whitmore had made one critical error in their planning. They'd assumed that Lord Edmund's secrets had died with him, but they'd underestimated the loyalty and memory of those who had worked closest to him. Victoria Hayes, as his personal secretary, wouldn't just be a witness to the restoration project irregularities. She would also know the humanitarian purposes behind Edmund's actions. "Your Majesty," Wells said as they prepared to leave for the warehouse, "when we find Queen Camilla and the others, you may finally learn the full truth about Lord Edmund's activities. Are you prepared for that?" Charles looked out the window at the ceremony preparations one more time, then turned back with the resolved expression of a man ready to face whatever truth awaited him. "I've spent 5 years wondering whether Edmund betrayed my trust or died protecting secrets I was too naive to understand. Whatever we discover tonight, at least I'll finally know." As they raced toward the industrial district, Wells reflected on how the case had evolved from a missing person investigation into something much more complex. But she was confident that they would find Queen Camilla alive, because Morrison and Whitmore needed her testimony to make their case credible. The question was whether they could reach the warehouse before the perpetrators realized their operation had been discovered. 20 minutes later, as Wells's team surrounded the apparently abandoned warehouse, she prepared for a confrontation that would reveal not just the truth about Lord Edmund's restoration project, but the real motivations behind a plan that had taken 18 months to execute. What they would discover inside would shock everyone involved, and ultimately prove that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are those who believe they're fighting for justice. The final confrontation would reveal that Morrison and Whitmore had been right about the financial irregularities, but completely wrong about their purpose, and that Queen Camilla's disappearance had been orchestrated not by enemies of the monarchy, but by people who had loved Lord Edmund enough to risk everything to clear his name.